Even though I would consider myself a casual Warhammer fan, many members of that community probably wouldn't consider me a fan. The lore has always been interesting to me. I've played some of the games, Boltgun, Darktide, and now Space Marine 2, although I'd like to get into it a little deeper. The tabletop game is just too expensive to justify as a college student, and I'm not going to read the books because I'm not a nerd. What the fuck? I'm kidding. I just never learned how. I'm familiar with some of the factions, terminology, characters, but not nearly enough to consider myself a part of the community. And for that reason, it's likely that said community also wouldn't consider me a fan, and that's okay. However, even as someone without a vested interest in the franchise, someone who didn't even play the first game, it should surprise nobody when I tell you that Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 is really, really good. I will avoid specific story spoilers and bosses, but there's a good chance I'll show a lot of the levels and enemies on screen in this video, so just a fair warning there. If you enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like, let me know in the comments, and if you'd like to see more like this, subscribe. The very first thing you'll notice about Space Marine, besides how drop-dead gorgeous it is how insane the gameplay looks. Part of me just wants to drop a 30-second clip of any random moment from one of my recordings and move on, because that would tell you all you need to know, but we're not going to do that. The last development project of Saber Interactive, the team that developed this game, was World War Z, and you can tell. A race of intelligent, constantly evolving bugs akin to a universal plague, the Tyranids resort to swarm tactics to overwhelm whatever planet they've chosen as their unfortunate target. You play as an Ultramarine, one of the Imperium's most esteemed soldiers. Your goal is to kill everything that stands against the Imperium, and you are amazing at it. Armed with a primary, secondary, and melee weapon, it truly feels like there is nothing more adept at killing than you. The combat is just brutal. It's incredibly simple. You can really only do a couple of things: shoot, aim, melee, parry, dodge, and that's it. Nothing crazy. But the simplicity is part of what makes it so satisfying to play, aside from the seamless integration between melee and ranged combat. As a Space Marine, everything you do is just so effortlessly badass. Bursting bugs with bullets the size of your entire arm, holding off hordes of them with nothing but a big rifle and a heavy pistol. It's largely similar throughout most of the game, but the base gameplay loop is so good that it literally does not get old. There are things thrown into the mix like new enemies, heavy weapons that occupy a third slot until they're out of ammo, and a couple of central level gimmicks that add a lot to the experience. To name a few, just so that this point is a bit more clear, a couple of main campaign missions include the jump packs, which is one of the most fun additions to the game. Another one of the levels takes place in an Adeptus Mechanicus fortress crawling with Rippers, which is the lowest form of Tyranid warriors, but that doesn't mean they're any less dangerous. Because of their small size and vast numbers, simply shooting them isn't a very effective method of dealing with them, so several lengthy sections of the mission revolve around the use of a flamethrower to keep them back while you work your way through the facility. Again, it might not be anything groundbreaking, but it is a very well implemented level mechanic that makes sense within the world. One thing worth bringing up as a potential negative is the game's enemy variety. I've seen a couple of reviewers discuss this as a negative, which I think is fair, but I don't personally agree. For most of the campaign, you'll be fighting the Hormagaunts and Hive warriors, and occasionally you'll see a Lictor, Ravener, Zoanthrope, and a couple of others that I'm not going to spoil because they're fun surprises. All the ones in the game right now are cool, but to some people they may get a bit boring. Again, I don't necessarily agree with this, but I see where that point comes from. There are so many crazy Tyranid types in the lore that could and should have been thrown in here, and I understand why they weren't, but things like the Venomthrope, Shrike, even the Biotitans or Mawloc would be kind of hard to include, but they'd be an incredible addition as bosses. Gargoyles are also here, but you don't really fight them, which was a bit of a letdown for me. This isn't a major breaking point, personally. It's barely a breaking point at all. I just figured I'd mention it, as it might be for some people. I'm sure we'll see more variations and types of enemies in upcoming content drops, assuming that they'll still focus on Tyranids, but who knows? Not me. There's also a decent helping of Chaos enemies that pop up in the tail end of the main campaign, which helps a lot with the variety, especially when you're not expecting them. Apart from its massive collection of firearms, Space Marine also has a huge focus on its melee combat. You have a choice between 4 weapons: the Marine's signature chainsword, a high-speed combat knife, the versatile power sword, which can swap between a heavy and light mode, and then a big-ass hammer. Those are your 4 choices in the campaign, although it might vary a little bit depending on your class in the operations. Regardless of which one you choose, you'll always have the ability to parry, which you can use to deflect attacks and also intercept any Hormagaunts that choose to leap at you, which rarely goes well for them. If you've recently lost health, you can regenerate some of it by dealing melee damage, or all of it in one go by performing an execution. On a parry or perfect dodge, however, you'll also have the option to swiftly follow up with a precise pistol shot, another feature that's just very useful and cinematic. Aside from weapons you can find in missions, you also get the option to select your weapons before a mission, which you'll gradually unlock the further you get. I don't want to drag this on too long though, so let's move on to the story. Once again, I'm not going to spoil any big story moments or bosses, I just want to talk about my thoughts on the campaign. Like I said in the intro, I didn't play the first Space Marine, nor am I super familiar with the Warhammer lore, but I really enjoyed the story anyways. Our main character, Titus, returns from the first game, which I didn't actually know until I started writing for this video, but regardless, I still felt the game did a good job catching me up to speed on his backstory and life prior to the events of this game. In a similar fashion, the story does an excellent job of explaining the things you're seeing and experiencing without feeling like a super hand-holdy exposition fest. I never felt lost, and more importantly, I never felt bored. The narrative itself is really interesting, but it's not really the main focus. To me, it was more an exploration of Space Marine culture, which is already well documented at this point, but it was cool to sort of play through it. Titus's two supporting characters, Chiron and Gadriel, are incredibly close when Titus shows up and just takes the position of their leader, which of course does not make them very happy, among other things. Much like Titus, we're exposed to the individual traits and backgrounds of Chiron and Gadriel as the campaign progresses and they learn to trust each other. Brotherhood is one of the core tenets of Space Marine culture, and it's one of the things that makes them such a terrifying force. And what the story is truly about is that brotherhood between our three main characters. The planets we visit all feel distinct, and the detail they manage to pull off with so many enemies and particles and bullets on screen while still running pretty smooth is unbelievable. I can't say a whole lot more without spoiling, so I'll just end the story section off like this. It's good. If you're buying it for the story, it won't disappoint. It's compelling, exciting, and well written enough to keep you invested the whole time. Let's briefly talk about operations. As far as I'm concerned, this is pretty much the bread and butter of the game. Although the story is chock full of insane cinematic sequences, the operations are comparable in length and give you a ton of personalization. To put it simply, ops are canon missions performed by a separate squad during the background of the main story. Because they are occurring at the same time as the campaign, Titus and the other story characters sort of guide you through the mission. Your objectives, status on the other mission, events currently going on, things like that. It's a small touch, but it makes each one really dynamic. Before actually playing these, I thought these would just be the campaign missions with some different encounter variety, and I'm really glad that's not the case, because each one is entirely unique. Rather than having a set ability and findable weapons like in the story, your build is now split between 6 different classes. Each of these has an ability like the jump pack, a grapple hook, a big shield, and so on. On top of this, you can then pick from a specific pool of weapons available to each class. This varies every one in several ways, forcing you to think about your loadout a bit more before each mission. It also asks that you be a bit more intentional with your decisions, since synergizing with the rest of your squad will help out a lot. But your options don't stop there. Operations also have a couple unique forms of progression. First of all, every class has several skill trees, one for class and ability buffs, and then each weapon also gets its own. On top of those, you can unlock cosmetic options for each weapon and your armor, with universal and class-specific options. The customization is quite frankly insane. You're able to individually color every single piece of armor, like you're given the freedom to paint your own Warhammer figure in-game. The operations are also very replayable, thanks to the game's great combat, so going for higher difficulty completions for new gear or more XP is actually really fun. The PvP, on the other hand, is just okay. I'm only going to talk about it briefly, because while it's enjoyable, it's a bit too simplistic for me, and the game was very clearly built for its PvE combat. It uses the same progression as Operations and currently has 3 modes: Annihilation, Seize Ground, and Capture and Control. Think of these modes like Team Deathmatch, Domination, and then like King of the Hill. The time to kill is really low, and I think that's where my main frustrations with the mode lie, because most of the fights just feel like they're dictated by who starts shooting first. Although, I did have a good time flanking with the cloak ability or jump pack and then just raining hell from behind or from the skies. While many people will probably enjoy the player versus player modes, it's just not for me, which is okay. Just before we close this one out, I'd like to talk about the future of the game, which looks particularly bright. For the current content roadmap, the developers already have new weapons, missions, enemies, and more planned over the coming months, which is awesome. However, in the campaign, they've already hinted at a continuation of the current story, so I'm sure we can expect narrative DLC at some point as well. the game has already been a huge smash hit, which was seemingly unexpected by the devs for some reason, and they've made it sound like they could be working on more content than they initially intended. Judging by the game's immense success, I can see them going full live service with this, developing new content for the game for years to come. In one of his new videos, SkillUp, who is another game reviewer, compared the idea to Deep Rock Galactic, which was another game that didn't start as live service but was so successful that people just wanted more. And, I mean, well, look how Deep Rock's doing now. But I guess that's really all I have to say about Space Marine. The bottom line is, if it looks like something you'll like, I can guarantee that you will in fact like it, because the game's great. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for more. While you're at it, be sure to like the video and let me know what you want added to Space Marine 2 in the comments. Thanks again, have a great night, and I'll catch you in the next one.